you control nothing. You influence everything. And I think that to me is it's almost like this beautiful Zen-like insight into what the reality is. That none of us is going to actually control where things go. None of us can know. But by the same token, we're all part of this unfolding system. We're all part of this potentially recreated future. So it becomes incumbent on us to then just recognize, let's we give us everything we've got to try to make that better future available to us. I don't know if it's going to happen. If I had to put odds on it, it would probably be a lot less than 50%. I'm not myself an optimist, but even if it was like 1%, then that is everything that is worth fighting for, everything that's worth putting your life into compared to the other outcomes.
Welcome to the Passing Through podcast, a show dedicated to exploring those spaces not just within, but also between and around us. The cracks in the walls, the moments between the moments. I speak with thinkers, authors, artists, teachers, and everyday humans who have touched the edge of the ordinary and found something to bring back. I'm coming to you from an unusual location this morning with unusual background sounds. I'm not alone inside Wilma, inside our Volkswagen Transporter. I am in an apartment in Lisbon, Portugal. Today's my birthday, and I just had not birthday cake, but a pastel de nata. And for anyone who's never been to Portugal, these delicacies, I hesitate to even call them desserts or pastries. These delicacies are so good that they should be criminal. I don't know how it's possible for something to taste that good without any consequence. Certainly, there must be some terrible hidden consequence, because it can't be possible for something to taste that good. I will have to go pick up my father soon at the airport, who will be coming here to celebrate the 40th anniversary of my time on this planet. And I wanted to take a moment to introduce this week's guest, because one of the coolest things about this podcast is that it lets me speak to people who I admire and look up to people who have contributed to my own development, who have helped me on my own personal journey, on my own path. And without this show, I think I wouldn't really get to interface with these people in the way I do. So I want to take a moment to just express some gratitude to the listeners, to the guests, to everything that makes this possible. So thank you for that, because I had the honor of speaking with Jeremy Lent this week. Jeremy is a visionary thinker. He is a founder. He founded the Deep Transformation Network. He is an author. He's written books such as The Patterning Instinct, The Web of Meaning, and most recently, Ecocivilization, making a world that works for all. Jeremy takes a systems thinking approach to assess our collective unraveling, which is, by definition, a systemic crisis. And in his work, he emphasizes how an ecology of practice and action is required to shift our global paradigms. His work helps us imagine the horizons of different shared futures as we transition from the horrors of the Anthropocene into a possible era of fractal flourishing. And this is exactly the sort of imaginative, re-enchanting work that I think we need right now, because to quote social critic Fredric Jameson, for most people, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And in his book, Jeremy invites us to imagine what civilization might look like if it were designed not for profit, but for life. So let's find out how we might make the most of this one and precious life we've been given, as we're all just passing through. All of the links that you'll need to find Jeremy and his upcoming book, Ecocivilization, Making a World That Works for All, will be in the show notes. That book comes out May 26th, and I strongly recommend it. I cannot recommend it strongly enough. It is as good as a pastel de nata. And I recommend checking out all his other books as well. As always, be good to one another, and I will talk to you next time. Welcome, Jeremy, to the Passing Through podcast. This is a special interview for me because you have been an influential teacher for me personally, and I've read all of your books, and I've been following you over the years. Not in a creepy way, only sometimes watching you outside of your home and always from a distance. And I only went through your garbage twice. But honestly, it's just really great to be here with you
Yeah.
and sit down. And I want to express some gratitude and thank you for your work and your contributions.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Danny. I'm really happy to be in this conversation today. So looking forward to this. Thank you.
Cool. And before we get into the what of the book, I'm wondering about the why. Why did you write this
Mm.
book?
Oh, yeah. Well, that is a great question. And I mean, in straightforward and simple terms, the why is out of really a kind of a deep commitment that I've made in my life to really be of service to life. I really feel like I'm devoting whatever I have left of years in this existence to life itself. And for each of us, that means something unique and something different. To me, because I've developed some skills in writing and getting ideas integrated out into the world, what that meant for me was I once I became aware of this vision some years back of a potentially really transformed future for our entire world system that was actually attainable, it felt to me like I needed to do everything I could to help to make that vision tangible and available. So that's what I've been spending these last few years of my life working on.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And writing, I would say, is one of your gifts. I really enjoyed reading this book. I enjoyed reading the other ones. And while I was reading it, I had a question. Did you have any moments of unlearning that changed the way that you thought about certain things or the world while you were writing this book?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I had a lot of unlearning in the early years of what I went through to basically write those earlier books that you described, like The Patterning Instinct and The Web of Meaning. There's a ton of unlearning, basically, literally decolonizing my mind and just discovering that almost everything I had taken for granted in my earlier part of my life was simply not the case. And so that was a ton of stuff around that. With this, not so much unlearning, but I think what I really did discover, and this really inspired me and kept me so alive, is that basically discovering that in every aspect of what we call civilization, these incredible ideas and profound thoughts and profound different ways of living life are available. And so
Mm.
that was pretty amazing. But actually now that I'm thinking about that, I'll go back and say, yes, there were a couple of things I unlearned. And I write about them in the book. Like one thing is around law,
Mhm.
interestingly. I discovered that what I kind of thought, like almost everybody else, the law basically is a good thing, law and order, like that's what we kind of need. I discovered that things we just take for granted about law are actually really, truly, simply the results of essentially tyrannical conquering groups,
Yes.
destroying, taking over, stealing, and basically devastating other groups. And then, because they're the ones who set the rules, they call that law. So these are the sort of things that I discovered. And I guess similarly around other things like money issuance or schooling, some of the things that I took for granted, I guess, as I started to research this book, I discovered every one of these are these kind of colonial structures of thought and structures of behavior that are not at all the way life is or the way it's meant to be, but simply the way that a dominant culture imposed on almost everybody else.
Yes. Yes. And I'm so happy you said that about law because that was one of those striking things from the book for me.
that I had the same kind of, wow, like this is the result of tyrannical rule. And it kind of paralleled with this other thing that stood out to me in the book, which was this outsized role that small groups of powerful elites have played in shaping the lives of everyone else on the planet. And
Yes.
you trace this from the enclosures of the 16th century all the way through to the present. And my question around that was, what is the mechanism that allows so few people to control so much?
Oh, yeah, another great question. And again, the simple answer to that is been a phrase that was defined by Antoni Gramsci, who was an Italian philosopher in the 1930s, imprisoned by Mussolini. He wrote these books in prison, basically, and died in prison. And it's called cultural hegemony. Well, that sounds like this big sort of difficult concept at first. But what it basically means is essentially this mass conditioning of almost everybody that is carried out by a whole group of ruling class elites and their lieutenant classes. Basically, what that means in the modern world is people like public intellectuals and lawyers and even maybe accountants or economists, especially, all these groups of people who basically share a um, a dominant worldview and languaging about things that doesn't allow for any other possibility.
Hmm.
And the notion of cultural hegemony is people like just get this sense that the system is the way it is because there is no other really natural way.
Yes.
And it's actually a good thing. And somehow, even though they might be oppressed by it, it's actually good for them for one or two reasons that they're told. And this is not just a modern phenomenon. You can sort of trace it back basically all the way back to original empires and the rise of hierarchies. And very early on in that sort of more recent history of humanity, the last few thousand years, those ruling classes discovered that they could actually get their way and keep in control. That sure, they could use violence to do that and just threats of killing people and arms and everything else. But there was a far more effective way to do it long term, which is to really get behind a cosmology that told people that it was the right way to do things. So it's all the way back to the sort of pharaohs or emperors who were considered to be divinity. And so you sort of uphold morality by being part of a priesthood or part of like the system that has them at the top. That was the old fashioned way of doing it. Now the way of doing it is neoliberalism and, markets work for everybody. And those multi-billionaires, well, it's good. They earned what they got. And look how what they've done for everyone else. What a great thing it is. And those are the kinds of things that allow this world of oppression to continue this way.
Hmm. That's a good point, because just a few days ago, I was having a conversation with someone who's educated, knows many languages, comfortable life, parents, normal kind of average person, smart. And we were having a discussion about big picture geopolitical phenomena that are happening right now. And when this topic came up, and maybe it was in my head because I was reading your book, and I brought up this conditioning that we're sitting inside of and that we've been subject to for hundreds of years, and how invisible it is. And it was interesting to me to see that the veil hadn't yet lifted for this person. These ideas were kind of new and novel. And it opened my eyes to show me that, wow, this is so powerful. And what makes it so insidious is that it's so invisible, that the work isn't coming
Yes.
from this hierarchical top-down place. It's like happening from within, invisibly, and we're just in it and we don't question it and we don't see it. So how can we fight it, is the question that I had for you. I was like, I want to ask
Yes.
Jeremy about this.
Yeah, well, I mean, essentially, think it's really what we can think of as a consensus trance.
Hmm.
And it's like, imagine you're in a world, which you are, which we both are, but in a world that's obvious to other people, like as if you sort of landed in some crazy place where you realize that everyone is under this spell and you're like trying to break it up.
Yes.
And you keep turning to each person and say, "Don't you realize?" And they go, "What's wrong with you?" Like,
Yes.
and how,
Yes.
how, how how do you break through this? And well, sort of think of it like the sort of old fairy tale of the Pied Piper or whatever, who essentially is trancing people as they go off the cliff. And another way of thinking about it is the Emperor's New Clothes, that famous story of, the emperor thinks he's got this new outfit and he's naked. And everyone goes, yeah, well, look at that wonderful emperor. And some young girl goes, but he doesn't wear anything. And that breaks the trance. And that's why I actually begin the book with Greta Thunberg, because she's an example of somebody who did break that trance. And she said, no, this is not right. If the system is causing us to destroy the world, then maybe we should look at changing the system. So I think that what it takes courage, because once you start to speak that truth, a lot of people, you get gaslighted. A lot of people say, no, you're wrong. Like, you're crazy. Like, there's something wrong with you. I think it takes community too. None of us can do it by ourselves,
Yes.
including Greta Thunberg, even though she started by herself, but then she got support from others, and now she's in groups with others. And the same is true for me and you and everyone. So it's like, look for the community. And then when you get to realize that there are tons and tons of groups and people, millions upon millions of people who recognize the same thing. And it's like reaching out to those, beginning to share that common language is, I think, crucial to making these changes happen, to realize we're not alone in realizing this. And we need to just amplify our voice. We need to cohere our voice and begin to see that we can actually get somewhere by joining together.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to dig into that a bit more, because I suspect that for some listeners, like maybe even this person is listening to the podcast right now, and they might want to understand, like, what is the thing that we're talking about here? And I loved the way that you put it in the book at one point, because you were drawing a parallel between this collective fear that we have right now of birthing a destructive AI. And you contrasted this with an algorithm that's already running, the algorithm of modernity itself.
Yes.
And I was wondering if we could unpack that. What is the algorithm of modernity? What is the thing that we're pointing to that people aren't seeing?
Yeah, and it does. It goes so deep. Because I mean, there's an algorithm of how our sort of social power systems work, but below that, there's something else. There's essentially a worldview that allows that algorithm, and in fact, encourages and almost like gives birth to our societal algorithm. So the worldview basically is a worldview that I described in a lot of detail in my earlier book, The Patterning Instinct and the Web of Meaning. And it's a worldview that really that almost all of us take for granted. This is the way the world is because it's so dominant now, but it only arose in one place and time in history, in early modern Europe, around the sort of 17th century or so. And it's the worldview of modernism. And basically what that worldview says is a few basic things, like that humans are fundamentally separate from the rest of life and better than, and the only things that truly have value and meaning. And in fact, the rest of nature is not something of intrinsic value, but is a resource, is a thing for us to exploit as much as possible. It's basically a worldview of separation. And even within a human being, it says, like, we're separate. Our mind is separate from our body. And in fact, our body is a little bit more like the rest of nature. It's this thing we can try to optimize and, get stronger and keep fit. But there's some essential difference of our self. In the old days, in early modern Europe, that was called the soul. And Descartes did this great job of translating that into the mind. So now we have this mind-body split. But so this separation goes between within the self, the mind, and the body, humans to the rest of nature, and it applies to us as individuals, that we are fundamentally individuals, separate from the rest of community, separate from the rest of life on Earth. And so as a result of that, well, basically the whole value of the whole meaning of life is to just look out for number one. Just kind of make as much money as you can, have as much power as you can, and maybe you might marry somebody and have a family that gets close enough to your sense of identity that becomes part of what you're trying to optimize for. And especially if you're a male and part of this system, then you have this sense that that's your sort of chance of immortality by passing on your genes to another little younger male version of yourself, that that patriarchal sort of concept. That is basically the worldview that we live into, that we're born into. And it's absolutely different from the worldview of any other culture in all of history, whether it's like East Asian cultures, indigenous cultures, African cultures, cultures from the Americas before they got conquered. And those other worldviews basically and this is part of what I describe in earlier books, have a lot in common with what modern science now understands. Like we think of that worldview as scientific, the one I just described. Um, and people like Richard Dawkins have done a great job of popularizing it.
Yes.
So, we think, well, that's science, isn't it? The selfish gene, we all like look out for number one. Nature does that. And actually, modern evolutionary biology, cognitive science, complexity theory, systems biology, all of these different modern understandings of science show that the worldview is fundamentally wrong. That essentially the world we live in is one that is based on deep interconnectedness.
Yes.
And our minds are not separate from our bodies. We humans are actually part of life. And life itself, once you begin to realize that, has intrinsic meaning. And we as humans evolved to actually have like a really collaborative identity. We evolved to actually identify as part of our group, not just our kin, but even those around us. That we had a really, really strong sense of group identity. And so once you begin to look at this different worldview, you begin to make sense of the world in very different ways.
Hmm.
So that's kind of at the deep level. But the only thing I want to do to connect that to what the world we live in today is that worldview of basically separation leads to this concept that it's okay to extract as much as you can from the rest of nature. That it's okay to exploit every other person as much as possible for your own benefit. And those core values of exploitation and extraction led to the modern dominant economic system of global capitalism. And it's no surprise that global capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, all those things arose the same time as that modern dominant worldview arose, in the same time and place, because they're all integrally related.
Yes. Right. And I want to make sure we get all of this because it's huge. This is a complex, vast thing that we're talking about here. And it is the source of this kind of soul sickness that's pervading our world right now. And it is accelerating the unraveling and the collapse that we're seeing. And as listeners hear this, they might feel like, oh, wow, that sounds really bad. Is there a way out of it? And that's where your book comes in, and that's where I like the topic that we're exploring here of an eco-civilization, because you identify 4 cornerstones that could help form the foundations of systemic transformation. You talk about UBI, triple bottom lines for corporations, the rights of nature, and citizens' assemblies. And rather than going through all 4, I thought I would ask you, which one do you think is the most underappreciated or misunderstood?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. And I've thought about that a lot myself. Like, in fact, I've at one point spent a long time drawing out this map that maybe at some point I might try to publish, like looking almost like a flowchart of all these different ideas of what an eco-civilization could look like and how they flow, how one relates to the other, to sort of look at the weave. And it became to be more and more clear that ultimately, if I had to choose just one thing that could actually change fundamentally, it would be essentially that notion of what you just talked about is of citizens' assemblies. And that relates to this question of democracy and really ultimately the question of power. Because and I'll sort of maybe I'll unpack that a little bit because there might be a bit of a people unfamiliar with this might say, well, what's this even talking about? Where does this come from?
Mm-hmm.
And so essentially what it needs first is an understanding of the kind of power structures we live in today. And most of us who are probably listening to this podcast, people either English speaking or European, are fortunate enough to live in relatively liberal societies compared to most people in the world today that we call democracies. Even though the country I'm living in the US, there is a real question as to
Yes.
if that even is the case or where that's likely to go. So those are big issues. And to begin with, I want to emphasize that with all their flaws, what we call democracy today is still much better than the autocracies and the fascism and the other regimes that most of the people live under. So let me be clear about that. But having said that, these systems we live in today are not really democracies, if we mean rule by the people, which is what democracy literally is meant to mean. It's essentially we can think of it more like electoral oligarchies. That essentially what these spaces that we live in today give people a choice every 4 or 5 years to vote for essentially one group of oligarchs versus another group of oligarchs. If we understand oligarchs basically to be people who are part of a small cadre of power, really wealthy elites that have a particular group that they've been part of, and they have their own agendas. And so, and even the groups that we might think of as more progressive, relatively, like whether the Labour Party in the UK or the Democrats in the US, are absolutely held by the same kind of agendas that ultimately relates to wealthy elites that or corporate elites that want them to do certain things.
Hmm.
So that is not actually really ruled by the people. And what is interesting is when you look through this, is that there are other options of actually what democracy could look like. It goes all the way back to ancient Greece. And if you look at like what happened in Athens, there was a really interesting philosophical treatise that Aristotle wrote. And he said basically, having elections is a form of oligarchy. He kind of called it out right from the beginning. He said the only way to get true democracy is through choosing people at random by essentially by what's called sortition, to represent actual people and have them together in a group and where they deliberate, make decisions, and then they revolve in and out. So they don't get to stay in power. And that's the way you get to avoid the concentration of power. And you might say, well, that, that might have been true for a small community. And of course, even then, they had their blind spots. They saw a democracy meaning just only men who were true Athenian citizens, and they were surrounded by slaves and women who they thought should have no rights whatsoever. So let's call that for what it is. But today, what's fascinating is the last few decades, there have been a rise in what are known as citizens' assemblies, which is a form of deliberative democracy, where people have actually, by sortition, sort of gone out to an entire group of society and brought them together to look at significant issues in a facilitated ways, to actually discuss them, sometimes for months at a time, sometimes maybe one weekend over a number of months, and maybe a 50 to 100 people or so. And these are facilitated conversations. And something amazing, like alchemy, happens when that happens. Rather than people getting stuck in their polarized positions, that you might think, well, of course, that's going to be a disaster. Look at social media. Look at how people are always attacking each other. The opposite happens. When people actually see each other in person, when they actually hear each other's stories and understand each other's perspectives, they begin to shift their own way of making sense of things. And they begin to see themselves as really responsible, not for their own political party, but for the society that they've been asked to represent. And these deliberative conversations, these citizen assemblies, have been shown time and again to come up with very deeply thought through solutions to core problems, and ones that build legitimacy and can lead to a fundamentally different way of thinking about power.
Hmm. And do you have examples of like one or two things where citizens' assemblies proved really effective, like just as a data point for someone to help them grasp?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, one wonderful example actually arose from Ireland, and it was interesting because they were looking at a couple of really, really hot button questions, such as abortion,
Hmm.
which in a traditionally Catholic country,
Yeah.
politicians were terrified of coming out on the wrong side of something like that, and equally hot button issue of same sex marriage. So the interesting thing is the politicians chose by election because there was a need for them to look at the potential constitutional amendments for these things, but they were terrified to make decisions. So they thought, great, let's punt it off to the citizens' assembly, so then we can let them come up with recommendations, and then it sort of gives them cover. So they did this, and what was fascinating is that rather than these conversations then leading to polarized debate and hate speech and all this kind of stuff, the opposite happened. These assemblies met over months, their conversations were made transparent so that people could actually watch them take place. And what happened is they would interview people, for example, women who either needed an abortion but couldn't get one, or who had an abortion, or they actually felt into the actual lived experience of people. And then they ended up coming up with recommendations before a referendum, in this case, to make abortion legal according to certain guidelines and parameters. And then that went into a referendum, and people voted along with what their recommendations were. And the amazing thing about it was not just that what you and I might believe is a good decision got made by the country, but the way it happened, it was far from being polarized. The exact opposite of things like the Brexit vote or the breakdown of political discourse in the US. It all actually brought people together because they were looking in a legitimate way at significant issues that would affect all of them.
This reminds me a bit of another piece of the book when you were talking about prison reform and how when you treat prisoners with respect as humans instead of put them in a punitive system that dehumanizes them, you actually see lower recidivism rates. You see better outcomes.
Yes.
So treating people as people and giving them the autonomy to make decisions and come together. And not just that, I guess there's also this aspect of community where it helps efface or erase that sense of separation that's part of this conditioning.
Yes.
And people come together and they see each other as humans and they say, maybe I had certain prejudices about people who were pro-abortion, but now that I'm with you and I'm hearing your story and I see the complexity of the situation, now I understand this better because it's a felt experiential understanding instead of an abstraction.
Yeah, I love the ways you're weaving these things together, Danny, and it makes me think that in a way, when we think of what we mean by an eco-civilization, what it essentially is about is a society that is based on recognizing and respecting the intrinsic dignity of every human being, as well as the intrinsic value of all of life. But just we're talking right now about human society. And I think that's what's fundamental because this is the way in which we as humans are. If we're treated as being worthless or cast out or useless or objects of hate or whatever, we begin to start bringing that into ourselves. It's almost like internalized depression. We actually take that in ourselves and we'll start acting that way. If we're actually treated by established institutions as being worthy of dignity, we'll step up to that. And your example of these prisons, Norway is the best example of these things. It's just incredible. There's actually prisons which would be viewed by most people to look like sort of holiday camps, right? Where people actually live normal lives out in the woods. And you have people who are convicted murderers, who've been convicted of violent murder. And these people are not kept in cells or whatever. They actually go and make food together in shared kitchens where like knives are like readily available to cut the meat with and stuff like that. Like actually, and they're trusted in that way. And even the prison wardens don't wear different clothes and they don't have guns or anything like that. They're basically there to almost like facilitate what goes on. And, it's just so far from our understanding of this notion of prisons as they're meant to be punitive because they view it in a different way. They view it as basically prisons are there to try to rehabilitate people in order to be functioning and respected members of society again. That doesn't mean that people don't have to take ownership of the fact they did harm and hold on to that. It's not about like just forgetting about the harm you might have done, but it's about owning it and then building from that rather than just having to endure punishment, which simply, as you say, essentially the way prisons work in our broken societies, like in the United States, they're essentially training grounds for criminals.
Yes.
It's like, if you want to learn to be a really good, hardened criminal, learn all the ways to be like violent, destructive, best thing you can do, get arrested, go to jail, and then you'll really get the education you need.
Yes, that's a very twisted point, that prisons become these sort of universities for criminality and crime, and
Right.
it's so strange. And there's a thing I want to grab onto here, because I could get a sense of a potential listener who might be going, okay, now they're talking about prison reform and giving prisoners all this choice. They're talking about deputizing people to make their own decisions instead of through representative government. This is all like really inspiring and lofty and wonderful. But isn't this a bit like rebuilding the plane while we're flying in it and while it's on fire? Because civilization is collapsing. And what's
Yes.
the point
Hmm.
of intelligent designs and horizon roadmaps and all of these kind of
Yeah.
reforms? Couldn't this just be seen as another expression of trying to control what is ultimately an uncontrollable system? Like, I have a little
Yeah.
bit of this tension inside myself even, and I wonder how you wrestle with that, or if you wrestle with
Yeah.
that.
And these are all really important things to look at. And and when you were talking before about we can look at this situation and think things are looking really bad. Yes, they are looking really bad. And this book is absolutely not intended to be some sort of hopium or like some sort of meta message that comes across saying, oh, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. Look at these wonderful things going on. We are really entering a very dark and terrifying era in the human race right now. And then that is exacerbated even more extremely by this rise of out of control AI, which threatens to make even the most severe and out of control elements of our system even more extreme and things to unravel even faster. So absolutely agree with that sort of view of what's going on in the world right now. The metaphor that I find most valuable when we look at that is the notion of that our society is unraveling. Oftentimes we might say we're headed to collapse. Well, we don't know where for certain we're headed to collapse, and even that can be determined. There's a very wide definition of what collapse means. Is
Mm,
it a house of cards collapses, and a week from now there's no internet, and everyone's like fighting each other in a Mad Max scenario? Or it could be, is it decades of of things just kind of mildly falling apart, and then who knows what happens? Or we could be headed for surveillance, authoritarian, techno surveillance states
mm,
where the billionaires basically own everything that goes on. All those are possibilities. What we do know is that the society that we've have grown up in is unraveling. And this is where I find the metaphor to be valuable, because imagine there is a rug, for example, that you have in your house, and you don't like the pattern, and you go, God, I want to change it. But you try to pull at the rug, you can't even begin to have any impact on it. It's so tightly woven, which is really what our society has been like for centuries, really. It's been a very tightly knit system of extraction exploitation. But that society is basically unraveling now as a result of its own internal contradictions, which is terrifying because people who live in elements of that society are experiencing some of that. It's not what I want. It's not what any of us should want, but it's happening whether we like it or not. But in that unraveling opens up degrees of freedom, because it's almost like it defines how difficult the challenge is, but also what the possibility of it is. It's basically, as those strands of the rug begin to sort of unravel by themselves, the job of anyone who cares about that positive future is to see if it's possible to reweave that rug into a different kind of pattern before it totally collapses, before it, like that opportunity goes. So we have an opportunity that arises from the very movement towards this kind of destruction of where we're at right now. So it is a bit like having to essentially rework that plane while it's on fire. I mean, that's a little bit more of a freaky metaphor, because you don't quite know. And there is a sense in which there's some truth in that, but we live in a complex system. And we live in basically not just a complex system, but a multitude of interlocking, nonlinear complex systems, both our social systems, then living in the living earth and those systems. And one thing you can know from that is that it is fundamentally unpredictable. To your question there about is this another form of trying to control outcomes? There's this wonderful quote that I love from a systems writer called Brian Klaas. He's written some really great books about systems and society. And a simple nugget that he's got on his website is goes like this: you control nothing, you influence everything. And I think that to me is it's almost like this beautiful Zen-like insight into what the reality is. That none of us is going to actually control where things go. None of us can know. But by the same token, we're all part of this unfolding system. We're all part of this potentially recreated future. So it becomes incumbent on us to then just recognize, lest we give us everything we've got to try to make that better future available to us. I don't know if it's going to happen. If I had to put odds on it, it would probably be a lot less than 50%. I'm not myself an optimist, but even if it was like 1%, then that is everything that is worth fighting for, everything that's worth putting your life into compared to the other outcomes.
Yeah, there's a lot of different threads that I want to grab onto in what you just said. I really loved the fact that you said that even if it's 1%, this is still worth fighting for, because I really believe that. And I think that life is that sacred and that important and that beautiful. And what you spoke about, the weave and being in this time of great precarity and uncertainty, and maybe the forces of darkness seem stronger than they've seemed. It reminded me of something that I heard Michael Meade talk about, where he was saying that in those times, you have more influence, you have more power to make an impact and make a difference, because everything matters more in those moments where the balances are shifting wildly and everything is so uncertain. So you are echoing a similar sentiment, which is comforting to me in a way, because you and him are thinkers that I think are very important for these times. And at the same time, I have a tension inside of me because I feel like Vanessa Andreotti is another thinker who I really respect. And her work inspires me in this paradoxical way where she seems to challenge, whether even looking for a path forward or trying to reform or transform a system that maybe we should be putting on palliative care and hospicing, maybe that's the way to sit with the mystery, sit with the complexity and the unknown and compost it and the unknowability and just feel into that. And I wonder, how do you respond to that kind of framework?
Glad you raised that, because that is an ongoing issue. And oftentimes people will really, really take that from what Vanessa says. And another example is this brilliant, almost mystical, poetic figure, Bayo Akamalafe, who I'm sure a lot of people know, who often says, similar things in terms of the times are so urgent. The one thing we need to do is slow down, which I love that statement. There's a lot of truth there. But I think my approach is somewhat nuanced, and it comes down to that phrase I was just quoting a moment ago. You control nothing, you influence everything. And my entire approach is really driven a lot by systems thinking. Most of my books and my entire sort of understanding of the world was really transformed by people like Fritjof Capra when I first started trying to understand things maybe 15, 20 years ago. And from a systems point of view, there's this concept of like an attractor. You can think of it almost like a gravitational pull. The different systems cohere together. And imagining we've got the system unraveling. If we just kind of go with the unraveling and just kind of compost, we're essentially giving up any kind of sense of agency around what direction we're trying to influence that system to move towards. And one of my deepest intentions is with this book, Ecocivilization, and also a coalition that I've co-created with some other people called the Ecocivilization Coalition, a group of leading change makers from around the world, is to try to set an attractor out there in the future of that possible life-affirming future, with the idea that this is not, I want to really emphasize, this is not some blueprint. This is not me or any number of groups of people saying, we've got the answer. This is what it's meant to look like. You can think of it more like contours. there's a model of change that I use fundamentally throughout the book that I feel is incredibly helpful, which is called the Three Horizons model. And just to give a real simple summary of what that means for people who haven't come across it, it's like imagine you're walking in an uncharted territory. And there's kind of the notion is there's three horizons. The first horizon is what is right in front of you. And essentially, that's really important. You want to make sure you don't trip over, fall into a ditch, or drown, or whatever it is. You got to focus on that first horizon. And in social movements, that's more like sort of keeping the lights on, trying incremental reform, and investing a little bit more in renewables, or doing some things like that. The second horizon refers to, you're looking out there, you see the mountains out there. That what you see is the horizon. That's the second horizon. Now, the second horizon refers to this notion of things that are maybe potentially attractive and disruptive, that really transform something, but they still stay within the dominant paradigm in one way or another. So, an example of a second horizon shift might be Tesla, totally disrupting the fossil fuel vehicles, but staying within the whole notion of global capitalism, this billionaire extraction, exploitation, but in a better kind of way or whatever. And the third horizon refers to the kind of potential future I'm laying out, like maybe like a life affirming civilization. And that is beyond what you can even see. But the thing is, if you're roughly aware of where that third horizon is, like imagine somebody sort of you're walking along in that first horizon, somebody comes down with a weather balloon and you get to hitch a ride. And just for a little while, you can float up and you say, oh, that's where that third horizon is on the other side of those mountains. And you see, you can get the contours of it and you get a rough sense of what it might look like. And you also get a sense of roughly the direction it is compared to where you are now. And then the weather balloon plunks you right down back for your step by step of first horizon. But now you have a sense of where you want to go,
Hmm.
which means that the first and second horizon choices you make would be the ones that might lead towards that kind of path that gets you to that third horizon sometime in the future. So I think that's a very worthwhile model because it gives a sense that um, the last thing I want to do is to try to tell people this is how it's meant to be, it's how it should be. But there are core principles for what a life affirming future actually would be, which are based not all I've done is kind of weave together what the great wisdom traditions of our world have always lived according to, what indigenous knowledge and wisdom tells us. Things like primacy of human dignity, going from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism, bringing power down to the lowest level possible in the system, incenting pro-social behavior rather than aggressiveness and selfishness. Fundamental things that most people would probably say, well, of course these are right. But it's from that we can agree on those, but then we can have all kinds of disagreements and healthy debates as to what that third horizon should look like. So that's to me is the difference between being attached to an outcome, which I don't think is such a great idea, but also not just letting go. Composting is important, but it really helps if you compost in the right way so that what actually will arise from that compost is something that's truly beneficial.
Thank you for that. I'm just letting it float in the silence because I think that was a very great answer. So thank you for that. And I know our time is coming up. So I have a couple more questions that I want to try to squeeze in before I let go of you.
Great.
I know you said that you yourself, you wouldn't self-describe as an optimist, but I found the book fundamentally hopeful. And it was a nice version of the future, I thought. And you've alluded to this in this conversation. I was wondering if you have a version of the future that keeps you up at night. Like of the possible ones that you outlined before, are there any that seem more horrifying than others?
Oh boy, there are so many the horrifying views of the future. I mean, um, I've begun to been fortunate, if that's the word, to have closer connections with people who are very close to the development of AI here in Silicon Valley, and seeing it with really, really open eyes as to the existential threats people like Tristan Harris and the Center of Humane Technology and others like that. And the vision that they see as unfolding at a very rapid and accelerating rate is absolutely terrifying. It's the potential, and the most extreme is the potential of actual a super intelligent AI that then optimizes for itself, and that humans and maybe the rest of life, just as a byproduct of it, just get wiped out entirely. There's a scenario of a small group of people, like such as the trillionaires to be, like Elon Musk, actually getting hold of such a technology and maintaining enough control over it that they essentially become the sort of unassailable dictators of all of humans on Earth,
Could
and
I interrupt you
almost
there
equally terrifying.
for a moment?
Yeah,
Because isn't it absurd that we live in a moment where it's almost like you're describing a possible reality, but it sounds like a a trope out of a Superman comic book where Lex Luthor
that's right.
like gets some kind of technology that's just going to ruin the world and only Superman can stop. Like it's surreal to me that we live at a time where this is kind of on the table right now.
That's right. It is. We are living in a time that we could not even, yeah, that any kind of futuristic writer would be, it would look like kind of futuristic sci-fi trash, basically. Similarly, look at the person who leads the most powerful country in the world right now, a complete, basically crackpot who changes his mind every few minutes and is like absolutely unpredictable and wild and irrational in every one of his actions. But we live in this time right now. These situations are so terrifying that all we can do is recognize they have to be taken seriously, but they point to the same issues that my book itself points to. What they really are is more like accelerants of exactly the same things we're talking about. And yeah, maybe a good place to kind of begin to move towards closure on. You said earlier, one of my chapters, I looked at this issue that some technology think has come about, which is this whole notion of how do you align this kind of AI or this super intelligent AI with the needs of human beings and of life itself, which is a great question they're asking. But what people fail to notice is that we've already created technologies that are fundamentally misaligned with human flourishing or life flourishing. The limited liability corporation,
Hmm.
the system that allows centi-billionaires to arise just from making a few tweaks to a technology like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or the rest of them. That is a system that is fundamentally misaligned with life anyway in itself. So the positive scenario that comes of this acceleration of these disruptions that AI and other things will produce is that it might just open up the space for far greater change than we might have expected to happen at a far sooner rate in a positive way. So I was giving that model of the three horizons. Over the years as I've been writing this book, I was feeling, well, that third horizon be way out in the future. Maybe it's almost like this notion of cathedral thinking. You're putting things together that generations from now people might benefit from, but you're not going to see them in your own life. But the rate of change is so massive that there's just a possibility that that is actually bringing that third horizon much closer into view than before. So the freaky and the frightening scenarios that we're looking at, to me, are even more reason to double down on devoting every single step we've got to not just trying to do good things right now, but looking at the deep systemic drivers of the destructive tendencies that are there and working to try to change those.
Yes, yes. Actually, this is perfect. You are at the doorstep of my final question to you, which is,
Uh-huh.
given the urgency of this current situation, which you have just outlined, and this sense that if we blow it now, we blow it for everyone, but maybe even all future intelligent life on this planet.
Right.
The stakes are high. What are some of the highest impact things that people could be doing right now?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. Great. Great to ask that. Well, I think the first thing to do is to look clearly at what is going on, to not try to get caught in sort of either hopium or even what I kind of view as almost like this sort of tending your own garden type of thing. Like, oh, this is so terrible. This is so destructive. Let me just tend what I've got. That basically is an outcome of unearned privilege. I mean, many of us are in a place in life as a result of 500 years of colonialism and extraction, where we've got fortunate enough to be born into a place where we got the education, the income, the maybe where we've got a skin color that we're not racialized, to be able to say, well, we have that choice to just close off, at least temporarily, to what's going on out there in the world. So the first thing to do is to not go down those paths, but recognize that we are part of life. Allow yourself to feel driven, not out of some sense of obligation, but recognizing that we are part of life. We do share a shared humanity with 8 billion people. We have the opportunity to give some of that privilege, some of that extra power to try to make things better. But we're not going to do it alone. So the next thing to do is then reach out to others in similar places. Find the community. Don't try to invent your own sweet little wheel when there's millions of people out there inventing fantastic wheels that you can be part of joining to make that happen. So join others. And then even when you're working in a group, don't just try to optimize for what your group is doing, but look for what other related groups are doing that might be similar, and try to spend as much time as you can helping them to strengthen what they're doing as what you're doing. And by doing all those things, you're doing great work. And one final thing I'd add is just looking at that three horizons model of change. There are most of the things going on in the world right now that are doing good, more first horizon things like trying to make this a bit better or get people to pay more in taxes or clean up pollution. Good things need to be done. A small percent, maybe 9 to 10% of the things being done are a second horizon, much more disruptive. And there's a tiny number of things being done that actually fit more into like that third horizon way of thinking, truly transformative work about like building groups according to the commons or coming up with new ways of democracy, like we was talking about before, or permaculture groups, or bioregional rethinking about connecting with the land. So the thing is, for anyone who's actually aware of these kind of paradigmatic shifts, it's good to be involved in any of these things. But because there's so few people working on that third horizon, if you get that sense of what's possible, then it's probably good to try to orient what you're doing more towards that third horizon, because that's where you can bolster even more effectively where we need to go.
Thank you, Jeremy. Beautifully said. And I'd like to give the last minute to you to just talk about where people can find you, when your book is coming out, where they can find it, and just give you space for anything else that you maybe wanted to share but didn't have an opportunity to.
Oh, sure. Well, thanks for that. Well, a few places I'd invite people to go is I've started to post regular articles on Substack. So you can just find me. It's a Substack post called Ecocivilization. And that's a nice way to kind of connect with me as we get closer to this book launch at the end of May and probably beyond that. That'll be a way to really kind of connect with the conversation. Secondly, there is a group called the Deep Transformation Network, which you can find at deeptransformation.network, where this is a group of thousands of people from around the world who have been really part of a conversation for years around what would a third horizon look like. And finally, I mentioned just really briefly, there is this group that I co-founded a couple of years ago that's beginning to really has put its roots out and really will be making a big impact in the years ahead, called the Ecocivilization Coalition. You can find that at ecociv.org. So it's easy to find. And I'd invite people to check that out. If you get inspired, sign up for the newsletter. And there's even a form you can fill in to get involved, where as the months and years go on, you can actually say where you're living, what you might want to do. And it's the very, very beginnings of what could become a more sort of planet-wide people's movement towards this future transformation.
Amazing. Thank you, Jeremy, for all of the work that you do, for this book, for coming and spending some time with me. This was an honor for me. You're one of my dream guests, so thank you for passing through. And it was great to speak with you.
Well, thank you, Danny. I so appreciate what you're doing. Love where your mind is going, your questions, and thank you for putting out this wonderful podcast that you're doing. I appreciate your work.
Thank you. Thank you for passing through today. Yeah, you, dear listener. Thank you for your support, for your attention, for spending some time with me and this episode's guest. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe, rate it, like it, tell your friends about it, buy a billboard somewhere next to a highway promoting it. I mean, I'm kidding, of course, but your support really does mean a lot to me. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next time.